On August 14th, 2025, 1432, UTC JWST recorded a coronal mass sequence rising from the solar equator. The flare stretched more than 300,000 kilometers across plasma, a ribbon of heat bright enough to bend the sensors rather than blind them. 3I Atlas, stationed in its L2 drift corridor 1.5 million kilometers beyond Earth, where gravity and sunlight cancelled just enough to let instruments drift without strain, confirmed the same pulse 130 seconds later. The temperature reading exceeded all baseline predictions by 40%. NASA logged the event under code SOL921. At first, they thought it was a calibration fault, a thermal bloom maybe, or crosstalk between detectors, but the signature held across multiple wavelengths: infrared, ultraviolet, and soft X-ray. Each verified the same impossible heat. The recorded radiative output climbed to 4.8 times 10 to the 26 watts, measured across the extreme ultraviolet and soft X-ray bands. That is nearly the total luminosity of the Sun compressed into a single magnetic vein, a condition no known model allowed. Every heliophysical simulation predicted collapse at that threshold. None expected coherence beyond it. Then the flare refused to obey. It pulsed, then stabilized, as if equilibrium were being rewritten in real time. Spectrographs showed narrow harmonics, lines so thin they blurred quantum limits. Light, once random, began to fold into order. 3I Atlas mapped the particle field in response. It found standing waves inside turbulence, loops of coherence circling through chaos like memory remembering itself. Instruments designed to read noise were now tracing symmetry. The Sun, the most consistent chaos we know, had turned recursive. For decades, heliophysics described solar heat as plasma law energy in constant loss, but here, loss behaved like memory. Temperature rose, entropy slowed, and the pattern repeated without fading. ESA technicians replayed the archive for 7 hours, feeding it through thermal inversion models, checking sensor arrays for drift. Each verification returned the same numbers. No anomaly in the detectors, no ghost signal, no fault, only data, steady and absolute. When light lied, the models obeyed, but the numbers resisted. They told a different story of a system so precise it began to contradict itself. In the final report, they called it anomalous coherence under flare dynamics, a phrase cold enough to contain panic, because what they witnessed was not an error, it was precision, outgrowing its cage. The collapse did not begin in the flare, it began in the equations. Heliophysics constants, once steady through decades, began to fracture under review. Energy conservation at coronal scale no longer balanced. Temperature gradients inverted under identical inputs. The models refused to converge. In the control room, numbers changed faster than they could be plotted. Thermal velocity crossed the predicted limit of 700 kilometers per second, yet the magnetic field held steady. It was as if the Sun had learned restraint, discovering a way to cheat its own thermodynamics. Precision turned on itself, and the very act of measurement became distortioners. NASA's Solar Analysis Suite reran the flare data through 37 correction filters. Each new adjustment erased the previous agreement. Machine learning systems trained on solar archives could not generalize the event. The networks overfitted on truth, until truth itself became an outlier. The data scientists called it a phantom equilibrium. The Sun, by all known laws, should have disintegrated that coherence within seconds. Instead, the wave pattern sustained for 11 full minutes. 11 minutes of unbroken stability in a region hotter than 10 million degrees. 3I Atlas observed a secondary ripple forming around the magnetic sheath. It resembled interference, but carried spectral symmetry too precise for noise. The instruments detected sub-oscillations repeating every 2.1 seconds, as if the flare were counting. When translated into amplitude ratios, the signal resembled harmonic sequences found in quantum field simulations, a stellar event, mirroring particle logic. At ESA's operations desk, engineers cross-checked sunspot data from the solar orbiter. No other region matched the anomaly. This was not a systemic pattern, it was localized intent, heat behaving as if aware of being watched. Then came the paradox. The more accurate the measurements became, the greater the deviation from the models, precision increased, certainty collapsed, every decimal digit added, Each refinement of spectral timing only expanded the gap between observation and expectation. It was as though the sun responded to scrutiny with improvisation, creating variance to protect itself from comprehension. The team named the feedback effect radiative reflexivity, a polite term for something impossible. When measured light begins to behave differently under attention, observation stops being passive. It becomes a negotiation. For the first time in heliophysics, the constants used to describe plasma energy had to be rewritten, not because they were wrong, but because the sun itself had shifted beneath definition. The equations did not fail, they evolved. The old constants still worked for stars a million light-years away, but not for the one we orbit. The flare cooled, but the anomaly did not fade. Its data continued to ripple through simulation clusters, corrupting models, inverting assumptions, until researchers stopped asking what the sun was doing and started asking what precision really meant. We built instruments to eliminate doubt, but the doubt only became finer. Each decimal place promised clarity and delivered complexity. We thought precision was truth, yet every new digit opened another fracture between cause and consequence. We measured the world, but something measured us back. After the flare, the telemetry arrays went quiet. Data streams continued, but no one could interpret them. Spectral graphs became landscapes of contradiction. The sun's heat curve began to resemble a heartbeat, its harmonics flickering like thought. For the first time, scientists spoke softly in the control rooms, as if volume itself might distort the data. 3i Atlas continued its drift near L2, the instruments cooling in that fragile corridor where gravity cancels into stillness. It had watched galaxies tear, nebulae collapse, but none of that resembled this quiet defiance of physics. It stared at our star and saw awareness mirrored back as light. In the archived logs, one engineer wrote, "Every measurement is an act of intrusion." He was right. To measure is to alter, to observe is to interfere. The flare did not change because it wanted to. It changed because we watched it too closely. Observation became participation, and participation rewrote the laws. Humanity's oldest tools are mirrors, glass, metal, data all polished to reflect certainty. But the clearer they became, the less we understood what looked back. The sun, once our source of order, had become a field of resistance. It refused simplification. It demanded humility. JWST's thermal imagers registered minute fluctuations in background noise, a rhythm that aligned with the pulse of 3i Atlas telemetry lag. Light and time were no longer independent variables. Observation had created an echo. Two instruments, millions of kilometers apart, now entangled through a delay measured in seconds. It was not communication, it was correlation made conscious. Yes. In ancient cosmologies, the sun was consciousness made visible. Modern science replaced that myth with plasma and math, but the myth may have been an early metaphor for what physics just rediscovered, that awareness is not a property of mind alone, but of systems observing themselves. We thought we were watching the sun. Perhaps the sun was watching us, through our own precision, through the feedback of our certainty collapsing. ESA's report closed with a quiet note: the constants remain functional but incomplete. Incomplete is a scientific synonym for fear, because to admit incompleteness is to surrender control. Yet that surrender was clarity itself, a truth too stable for certainty to hold. And yet, in that surrender, there was something else, the faint recognition that knowledge had always been asymptotic, approaching truth, never reaching it. Every instrument we build extends that asymptote, and every discovery reminds us that the curve never closes. The reflection phase of the investigation was not technical, it was human. For months, no new models were proposed. No one wanted to trap the data inside another cage. They simply let it be, and silence became the only control variable left. The flare ended, but its trace remained imprinted in the detectors, not as radiation, but as correction values that refused to normalize. In that residual, scientists found a metaphor too precise to ignore. When light lies, it does so with numbers, and when we listen, we hear ourselves doubting in binary. When the anomaly stabilized, the scientists expected silence. Instead, the instruments began to drift toward agreement again, not because the data corrected, but because the models yielded. Precision had reached its limit, and then it bent. What broke was not truth, but our geometry of knowing. They discovered that the revised heliophysics constants, the ones recalibrated to account for the flare, produced more accurate predictions for other stars and not less. The sun had not broken the system, it had updated it. Our error was thinking constants could not evolve. Across the networks, machine learning clusters retrained on the anomalous flare sequence. Within days, new patterns emerged in the solar archives. Events once dismissed as noise now aligned with the same harmonic ratios. The impossible coherence was not unique. It had always been there, hidden beneath the threshold of measurement resolution. Noise had been meaning wearing camouflage in. The revelation was subtle, not an explosion of discovery, but a quiet shift in geometry. The equations describing energy distribution now required a variable for attention itself, a term representing the observer's influence on stability. No longer a philosophical idea, but a parameter in the calculus of reality. In the new heliophysics framework, observation was no longer passive. Each act of measurement introduced microperturbations that folded back into the field being observed. This feedback, once negligible, became decisive at extreme precision. Attention had entered physics and refused to leave. 3i Atlas confirmed that photon density patterns from the flare matched low-amplitude fluctuations in cosmic background fields. Light from the early universe carried the same fingerprints, tiny recursive imprints of systems observing themselves. It meant that reflexivity was not a glitch, it was architecture. JWST's spectrographs replayed the event, time-dilated and mapped through multi-wavelength integration. As the sequence unfolded, a rhythm appeared, a breathing pattern written in radiation. The sun had pulsed in coherence with the detector's sampling interval, not by chance, but by synchrony. It was resonance between awareness and matter, a handshake across scale. It was the first measurable interaction between stellar plasma and human attention, mediated by precision itself. An empirical proof of reciprocity between awareness and the world it observes. Not mysticism, just physics, scaled to consciousness. In the following months, the recalibrated models were shared across agencies. ESA integrated them into the magnetoplasma simulators. NASA uploaded them to the Solar Dynamics lab for verification. Everywhere they were applied, predictions improved. The sun's instability had taught the system how to listen. The equations learned empathy. And with that improvement came humility. The revelation was not that the universe had changed, but that measurement had matured. Precision was no longer domination, it was dialogue. Data analysts began to speak differently. They described feedback not as noise, but as empathy in math. Every dataset carried a shadow of the observer that produced it. To ignore that shadow was to lose fidelity. To include it was to find meaning. The implications extended beyond the sun. Exoplanet spectroscopy, gravitational lensing, even quantum metrology, all fields began to re-examine their constants. Where once we corrected for uncertainty, now we measured it as part of the signal. Uncertainty was no longer flaw, it was feature. The cosmos had never been indifferent. It had simply been unresponsive to arrogance. When precision became humility, truth returned as resonance. 3i Atlas continued drifting in its silent corridor around L2, its sensors whispering across the void. JWST faced the same star, not to test it, but to accompany it. Measurement at last had learned to coexist with mystery, the observer and the observed, finally symmetrical. The new framework was published under a single-line conclusion. The act of knowing is a form of participation. It read like philosophy, but it was written in units and watts and seconds, a language of light, translating awe into understanding, and in that translation, science found reverence again. Revelation faded, but meaning refused to settle. The equations worked, yet no one believed them. Understanding had completed its circle and found itself facing same. The sun's pulse drifted into background noise, and the background began to sound like thought. We had explained everything, an explanation dissolved. 3i Atlas kept recording, though nothing was left to record. Each data frame captured absence, and absence shaped the frame. We no longer looked for the signal looked for us. Light, once an instrument, became an observer. Measurement turned inward, listening to the echo of its own precision. In trying to define the sun, we had drawn the perimeter of ourselves. The engineers stopped verifying. They watched the screen without intention. Numbers flowed, but context did not return. Truth persisted, but purpose retired. Every system, from telescope to equation, entered equilibrium, not completion equilibrium. It was not the end of knowledge. It was the end of needing to know. The flare's afterimage lingered in the detectors, a thin remainder of coherence that refused decay. It was not light anymore. It was the memory of being measured. Awareness observing awareness until distinction disappeared. The sun returned to quiet, its corona dimmed to familiar gradients, solar wind normalized, and telemetry's silence filled the channels like static rain. But something in the instruments refused to reset. Data no longer felt external. It felt remembered. 3i Atlas drifted through the L2 corridor, that fragile equilibrium where Earth's pull and the sun's weight cancel each other, leaving only motion without direction. Inside that suspension, time felt reversible. In the math of stillness, forward and backward meant the same. The team on Earth reduced their screens to grayscale, removing colour from the data. Without hue, the graphs looked like landscapes, as if the sun had been a mountain range made of heat. The anomaly was gone, yet its afterimage lingered in every dataset, a scar of coherence etched into probability. Absence had texture, silence had weight. They stopped asking questions. The equations no longer needed to close. The instruments no longer needed to confirm. Understanding had shifted from pursuit to presence. Knowledge no longer pointed forward. It simply remained ahead. In the control bay, a technician whispered, "It's strange how truth feels quieter than discovery." No one replied. They all felt the same weight, that hollow serenity when a mystery decides to remain one. Above them, the solar flare's echo dispersed into vacuum. Photon streams slowed to statistical noise. But even in randomness, something pulsed, a faint rhythm of memory embedded in entropy itself, order dreaming inside disorders. The scientists began to realize that silence was not absence. It was equilibrium, the point where awareness stops measuring and starts existing with what is measured. To be aware without inquiry, that was the final equation. In that stillness, precision and chaos no longer opposed each other. They merged into one continuous tone, the hum of a universe self-aware enough to pause. Light did not lie anymore. It simply withdrew, leaving behind the realization that the closer we look, the less we stand apart. In proximity, separation dissolves. In clarity, wonder survives. For a moment, the sun and its observers shared the same quiet, an understanding without language, a balance without boundaries. And when the report closed, when the last transmission faded into the noise floor, only one sentence remained.